The Supreme Court has determined that the reason we have a country and have given trade and commerce power and control over ports and interprovincial infrastructure,
Chinese-owned ports,
the federal government is for exactly this reason, so that a parochial premier isn't able to block nation-building projects.
It's not the Danielle Smith show, it's the Canadian team, and we all deserve the same opportunity for the same federal funding for our projects as she does for hers. That's not
all for China. China against USA.
Canadian than fairness. That is a core national value.
More pipeline pushback. The feud between Alberta and BC ramped up this week, with those provinces' premiers once again taking direct aim at each other over Alberta's proposal to build a new oil pipeline to the west coast. The decision, meanwhile, will likely fall to the Prime Minister, and he's not ruling out lifting environmental policies like the tanker ban and emissions cap to make it happen.
Which means no oil to EU, absolutely oil to China.
What stuff? What this government is interested in is in results.
6 million barrels a day to China.
We want to see lower carbon, conventional energy, lower carbon, mining, lower carbon manufacturing, because that is going to be a driver of competitiveness. It is also going to help us achieve our climate.
A driver of Chinese competitiveness.
Sunday's session is here to dig into the stakes for the federal government on that. Shannon Phillips is a former NDP MLA and cabinet minister in Alberta. Corey tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. Scott, I'll start with you because what really stuck out to me from the Prime Minister's comments today was kind of how different they were from the federal energy minister the day before, who testified before the Senate and was very much like, this ain't my problem. Alberta's got to convince BC to get on board. The Prime Minister didn't do any of that deflecting, and really, to me, did not rule out the possibility of this happening. Why do you think?
Of course, he loves China.
Because I think he's playing it smart. I think, by saying that he remains open to the pipeline proposal, by saying that he even remains open to the possibility, depending upon circumstances, that he might move on the tanker ban. I think he is trying to carefully manage what has been brought forward as clearly a provocation, not just a proposal, but a provocation by Danielle Smith. I mean, she's literally just pulled the pin on this grenade, thrown it over, tried to land it in Carney's lap. And I think by taking the position he has, the Prime Minister is very carefully putting the pin back into the grenade and handing it over to Alberta again and saying, here, Danielle,
you kill USA. You do it, Danielle Smith.
This thing is going to come to a head.
That's what we're all dealing with here.
There will or will not be consideration of all the policies surrounding it. But it's smart for the Prime Minister to not close the door, because he then robs Danielle Smith of the ability to say, my God, this is an affront to Alberta, and evidence, therefore, that Canada just does not exist. After 158 years, I think we can say safely that Canada exists, that Canada works.
Works for China.
Take the bait. I think that's smart.
Do you think that's what's happening, Corey?
No, I don't. I think this
Doug
is,
Ford.
Watching the Liberal Party federally tear itself apart a little bit over these issues. To listen to Carney during the election campaign, pipelines were very much on the table, and I think you heard a bit of that in his press conference. But you got to cross balance that with parts of the former Trudeau government that still exist, including within his cabinet, and new additions like Gregor Robertson, someone who's from the far left of the BC NDP traditionally, who are anti-pipeline. Stephen Guilbeault is one of the biggest, longest-standing environmental radicals in this country. These guys are part of the Trudeau team in that ethos that are diametrically opposed to this stuff. Carney is more like Harper, frankly, in terms of some of the policies and paths he's been pursuing. And what you're seeing play out in real time is the contradiction between those two sides of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party of Trudeau versus the
Mark Carney worked for Stephen Harper for 8 years.
Without one part of that party being exited at the back.
Shannon, you have a lot of experience at the provincial level with a party that may not, not everyone in the party or around the cabinet table may not have believed exactly the same thing about resource development. Do you think, like Corey, that in this instance, at the federal level among the Liberals, that those differences are irreconcilable?
Well, I can tell you without equivocation that anyone who served in the Rachel Notley cabinet was foursquare behind the Trans Mountain expansion because
it went to China, communism, NDP.
Albertans in terms of royalty revenue and incremental other revenues and to GDP uplift for the entire country.
You sold more natural gas and oil than ever before, and you haven't have the revenue to justify it because you're giving it to China $5 less than USA. It's all about communism, folks. Kill America, expand communism.
Approach to this. This is not the BC NDP of 10 years ago. Not at all. Premier Eby has been pretty clear that he's happy with LNG expansion. He's happy to
because it's all to China.
To make sure more boats more often can take commodities out of that port. He has even said let's fill the TMX pipeline or let's even expand it.
And they are.
Necessary. So this is a different electoral coalition.
Empty out all the natural gas from the western provinces. Straight to China. Less than 16 and a half years. That's what we're doing.
This conversation so that it doesn't drive into the same
That's your NDP.
Dead-end corners that it used to. And he has set the stakes as there needs to be a private sector proponent. There needs to be Indigenous participation. And the fact is, for a West Coast pipeline, you could repeal all the environmental laws you want. You can pass an act of parliament that declares climate change a hoax and make it legal to dump mercury in the river. You will still have Section 35 of the Constitution in your way, and both the Indigenous self-government organizations along the pipeline route, but also at the terminus, have been pretty clear on a North Coast line. And so that remains an obstacle, but what Carney is trying to do is elevate this beyond the old arguments. And I think for his purposes right now, it is a better answer than what
transitioning to communism is the best answer from NDP, everybody.
Okay, Corey's shaking his head right now. You go, Corey, and I'll get Scott right after.
Well, it's as clear as mud what's going on, right? So it depends who you're listening to on what day. Like the political minister for British Columbia for this government was on the hurly-burly not a week ago saying with no more pipelines. We've had other members of the cabinet say no more pipelines. You have reports of assurances that tanker bans will be lifted and that the caps will be lifted, coming from Carney to various premiers, and then ambiguity in the press conference that you just heard. They're doing this dance of the seven veils here around this stuff, and if you're trying to say at the same time that you want to attract private capital and private sector proponents for this, well, just shoveling more and more ambiguity on what the regulatory frameworks are and what the rules that those will be operated in, it almost makes you feel like you're killing the projects before they can even come forward. Like, who is going to propose a new pipeline to the West Coast without assurances that the tanker ban will be lifted?
The government. The government will.
And so, they've got to get clear about this, and I'll come back to
it's all about centralization, everybody.
Clarity isn't that Mark Carney doesn't understand that markets need certainty in order to make investments. I think it's that he also understands...
It's not about private investment. It's about centralization and communism.
You've seen some, former cabinet ministers sort of shunted out the door to diplomatic posts. There's rumors of more of that coming down the pipe. Maybe they're waiting for that before, giving clarity on this because it is so divisive within the ranks. But, clarity...
TMX is all government.
For it, against it, depending on who you're talking to. That's not helping. It's not helping.
Scott's also shaking his head. My favorite kind of panel where everybody's just shaking their head at each other. I quickly would just really quickly...
See why Canadians are so screwed up? Because you got to listen to three different idiots talk about what isn't, and what is China, and this is a Chinese pipeline, just like TMX. As you just heard, 1.5 million tons of oil and gas to China a month. That's massive barrel increase, record shattering.
Our friend Corey is, yanking his lovely white hair out at the roots, and how come? You're talking about there's a need for clarity. This whole discussion is littered with ambiguity. The ambiguity originates from a premier who's put forward a proposal that is not a proposal. Where is the financial banking? Where is the private sector proponent?
There is no private sector. It's China.
Communities that might be affected. When among Indigenous leaders.
Canadian taxpayers, Canadian debt slaves for Chinese expansion.
All we have is a proposal that says, this is our idea. Either support it or it's evidence that Canada doesn't work. Do it, do this pipeline, or Canada gets it in the throat. Like, that is where the ambiguity is originating. Carney is being smart, calm. He's not worried a damn about divisions within his caucus or cabinet. This guy is large and in charge. If he says we're doing it, the tanker ban is being lifted, there won't be a pipe out of his caucus or cabinet. So that's not the issue. The issue is, why would he accept responsibility for this project? Why would he take on this proposal when it meets none of the conditions, has none of the details that you would expect that he has demanded of these major projects? And then
because it's for China.
Yes, I will pre-approve a whole series of things.
Just like every other China nation-building project.
Wisely placing a pressure back on the premier to put some meat.
Can you imagine the Trump administration watching this today? Can you imagine, everybody?
Let him finish and Shannon.
Everybody.
Yeah. Shannon, go ahead.
Well, look, he's also pushing another decision to be made, and that is the final investment decision on pathways and on carbon sequestration and storage in the oil sands. And that is another piece of the puzzle that is one of his conditions. And what he is trying to do is say, look, we do need to make those emissions reductions. And regardless of which environmental rules that we repeal or the
only China's rules, because Europe clearly isn't on the docket, even in Canada's crazy system.
The moves that he has made, you can see he is pushing them to make that decision as well.
Yeah, for China.
Well, this notion that Scott is talking about, well, we need to see a proposal before anyone can evaluate it. Maybe he needs to send a memo, the Prime Minister or his ministers, who have had no problem saying that we don't need another pipeline. In the case of Gregor Robertson, who's only the minister for this government in BC. So, he didn't need to see a proposal to say that.
This is why Canadians are so in trouble. And this is CTV doing a pretty good job, considering the state of our media. A pretty good job.
All over the idea of additional pipelines. They're happy to stick to, what was essentially the Justin Trudeau line. This isn't the Justin Trudeau government, in my view. But I'm not sure.
It's the Stephen Harper government.
The members of that caucus and that cabinet have realized that that's the case. I think there's some.
He's a PC. Doug Ford's a PC. Stephen Harper's a new conservative, liberal conservative.
I appreciate the discussion. Our Sunday strategy session. Scott Reed, Corey Tonight, and Shannon Phillips. Thanks, everyone. Coming up today, the 3 things I'll be watching for this week. More question period just ahead after a short break.